The Roman invasion of Britain by the order of the Emperor Claudius in 43 AD was the trigger for some of the most bitter fighting these islands have ever witnessed. The very freedom of the native Britons was at stake, and like any proud people before or since, they would not part with their liberty without a fight to the death. The northern borders of the Roman Empire were witness to scenes of frenzied preparation. The Emperor Claudius, in the second year of his reign, had decreed that the tribes of Britain should feel the might of Rome. To the Romans of 2,000 years ago, the island of Britain was a land of mystery and legend, from whence only scattered and fleeting reports reached Italy. Nearly 30 years before the invasion preparations, a Roman fleet had been caught in a storm and blown onto its forbidding shores. When the survivors eventually returned to Rome, they brought back tales of terrible hurricanes, sea monsters, and the bizarre pagan rituals of an untamed warrior society. Britain was on the very edge of the known world, which was thought to consist of the continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa, surrounded by an endless sea. According to the science of the day, the large, mysterious island of Britain should not even exist. But exist it did. Britain at the time was a patchwork of tribal kingdoms, inhabited by people known as the Celts. The Celts began migrating from their homelands on the Upper Rhine and Upper Danube around 500 BC. Led by their warlike aristocracies, they settled in France, Spain, northern Italy, and the British Isles. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Celtic settlement of Britain occurred in three main phases. Around 500 BC, people of what has become known as the Hallstatt culture settled here, primarily in the south and east and on the Yorkshire coast. These people had discovered iron, and this was the material they used to make their weapons. The next incursion occurred around 250 BC, and these people again settled in the south and east of Britain. They introduced the light two-horse war chariot into British warfare and the Latine art style in British culture. The final Celtic influx began around 100 BC, when Belgic peoples began to settle in southern Britain. Bitter foes are both the Germans and the Roman invaders of Gaul. Julius Caesar's Gallic conquest and the transformation of Gaul into a Roman province added impetus to their movement across the Channel from 58 BC onwards. The Britons, as these peoples were collectively called, had no written language, so that all we know of them comes from archaeological evidence and the few surviving accounts of their Roman enemies. Society was hierarchical, with an aristocracy of warriors, priests, and bards at the apex. And below these came the land and property-owning free men, and below these the bondmen, whose labour was put to use by those above them. At the bottom of the heap were the slaves, which could have entered slavery by birth or by capture in war. Although agrarian in nature, the British economy was well above subsistence levels and could support a thriving class of craftsmen. A chainmail armour, with its intricate and painstaking manufacturing process, is thought to have been a Celtic invention, and the Belgic tribes were already producing coinage. A system of tribute was levied at all levels, the lower orders paying to the aristocracy, the aristocrats paying tribute to their tribal king, and in some cases, tribal kings paying tribute to overkings. The Celtic tribes were by no means united, and there was much competition between them. Warfare between the tribes was endemic and ranged from minor cattle raids to kingly campaigns aimed at dominating weaker neighbours. The culture of the Roman invaders was very different from that of the Britons. The mighty Empire of Rome had begun as a minor city-state in mid-western Italy, thought to have been founded in 753 BC. By 272 BC, Rome had gained control of the whole of the Italian peninsula. Thereafter, a succession of wars left the Roman Republic with a growing list of overseas provinces. 3 wars with the Punic Empire of Carthage added the provinces of Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, further Spain, hither Spain, and Africa. Similarly, a series of wars with Macedon and Mithridates added Greece, Syria, and Bithynia Pontus. Smaller-scale wars added Casalpine and Transalpine Gaul, Illyricum, Cilicia and Cyprus, Crete and Cyrene. The province of Asia was founded when the last king of Pergamon left his kingdom to Rome upon his death.
The Roman army, of course, the first word always associated with it is discipline. They were highly trained to fight in these famous legions, in the various formations required. There were 3 different types of infantry. There were ala of cavalry. They even had their own artillery train, as understood at that period, and the whole thing was a very disciplined war machine. Now that was very necessary for one good reason. By the laws of Rome, commanders of armies were often politicians who became commander just because they were, say, consul, whatever it happened to be. So the legions had to be able to carry this, shall we say, rather second-rate actual commander. On other occasions, of course, when they have somebody like Julius Caesar, one of the great captains of history, they are led with the most tremendous elan and verve and effectiveness. But with this great background, therefore, of discipline, particularly discipline at the century level, where a centurion commanded 80 men rather than 100, defense cuts happened then as they do today, you have this army coming up against a barbarian army, one of the individual warrior culture. And all things being equal, as in war they very rarely are, the Romans would have a tremendous advantage over semi-trained, however valiant, horde tactical using barbarian forces. And so it would prove on both these 2 raids to England. Now this was not a condition only appertaining to ancient warfare in the far, far away histories. If we just come up as recently as 1982 in the Falklands campaign, it was widely observed that the difference between all regular troops in our Marines and paratroopers and eventually battalions of infantry and Gurkhas when I put into that island against an enemy who was 3/4 conscript soldiers, there is no comparison in their fighting skills.
This large overseas empire put increasing strain on the Roman government. Power in the Roman Republic centered upon the Senate, which was largely controlled by an oligarchy of the leading Roman families. The Senate had begun as a city council and found it increasingly difficult to control its new provincial governors, and more importantly, its far-flung generals. Consequently, the last 50 years of the Roman Republic witnessed a series of bitter civil wars. Against this background, real power in the late Roman Republic began to rest more and more with the legions. A man with loyal soldiers at his back was automatically a force in Roman politics. Consequently, generals attempted to prolong their commands as much as possible. A towering figure in Rome during this period was Gaius Julius Caesar. Before he was murdered in 44 BC, Caesar managed to become Rome's sole ruler, though it was his heir Augustus who first adopted the title of emperor. In 59 BC, Caesar was given command of Casalpine Gaul, Illyricum, and Transalpine Gaul for a period of 5 years, and promptly set about the conquest of those Gallic tribes not already subject to Rome. In addition to being a great general and statesman, Caesar was also a prolific writer, and his account of the conquest of Gaul has come down to us through the ages.
Quod omnibus fere Gallicis bellis, hostibus nostris inde subministrata auxilia interlegebat. Et, si tempus anni ad bellum gerendum deficeret, tamen magno sibi usue fore educebatur, si modo insulam adisset, et genus hominum perspexisset, loca portus aditus cognoisset. quae omnia ferre gallis erant incognita. Neque enim temere, praeter marcatores, illo addit quisquam. Neque eis ipsis quidquam praeter oram maritimam, atque eas regiones quae sunt contra Gallias, notum est.
I think we must appreciate that Caesar did not really intend to invade Britain on either of these two landings, either in 55 or 54 BC. It wasn't meant to be a D-Day type of operation to put a large army into Britain for keeps. It was essentially a reconnaissance in force on both occasions. On the first occasion, it was almost an away day kind of trip. It was only ashore, we think, for about 36 hours before they went back. He was trying to find out who were these pestilential Britons who had been giving succour, support, and indeed some men to the Gauls, which he was hard at work conquering, of course, in what we now call France. The second time he came was rather longer. He decided to have a look in depth, reconnaissance in depth, if you like, and in fact spent several weeks in England with 2 or 3 legions, conquering the king of the South Britons, who was induced to become a tributary of Rome, to pay taxes to Rome, before, again, Caesar and his legions pack up, back onto the boats, and back to the continent. So both these attacks were only raids, basically speaking. And it would not be, in fact, until 43 AD that one of the successors of Julius Caesar in the reign of the Emperor Claudius, that the real invasion and conquest of Great Britain would begin. From that time onwards, we are part of the Roman Empire. We weren't in 54 or 55 BC.
In 55 BC, Caesar took 2 legions and 80 transport ships with him on his first expedition. Warned of his coming, the Britons gathered to contest his landing. In the face of this determined resistance, the legionaries were very reluctant to disembark from the ships. Caesar recalled this famous incident in his Gallic wars.
Atque nostris militibus cunctantibus, maxime propter altitudinem maris, qui decimae legionis ferabat, contestatus Deus, ut ea res feliciter legionae evenerit. Disilite inquit, milites, nec vultis aquilam hostibus prodere. Ego, curte, meum rei publicae atque imperatori officium praestitero. Hoc cum voce magna dixiset, se ex navi projecit, et in hostes aquilam ferre coepit. Nostri, cohortati inter se, nec tantum dedicus admitteretur, universi navibus desilu erunt. Hos item, ex proximis primis navibus cum conspixissent, subsecuti hostibus ad propinqua verunt.
On the occasion of his first expedition, Caesar just managed to avert a disaster. An amphibious landing in the face of a prepared enemy of superior numbers is always a dangerous undertaking. He took some British hostages, but didn't stay in Britain for long, and achieved little beyond the limited aims of a reconnaissance in strength. Caesar returned to Britain the following year with 5 legions, auxiliaries, and some cavalry. But despite being better prepared, he again achieved little other than the taking of further hostages and the promise of future tribute. He defeated the local tribes in a fierce battle near the coast and appears to have left for France the same day. It was left to a later successor, Claudius, Rome's 4th emperor, to achieve a lasting conquest with his invasion of 43 AD.
The Roman army, of course, was basically, as you might suppose, a land-based animal. Although they were very experienced at fighting galley-type battles in the tideless Mediterranean, the Romans, of course, had defeated Carthage a long time before Caesar on these terms. When they came out through the Pillars of Hercules, or the Straits of Gibraltar, as we call them today, and into tidal conditions, they were very much at sea, to coin a phrase. And the Romans were not natural sailors in the sense the Portuguese of later centuries would be, or the Spanish, or indeed the British in further centuries ahead. As a result, this invasion was probably made, the first raid by Caesar, under conditions of very seasick troops, and also a great deal of doubt amongst his admirals about how they could calculate what the tides were doing in terms of when it was safe to go ashore and so forth. So this was a tricky operation for the Romans, who had, as far as we know, never gone out onto the open sea from the Mediterranean before this occasion. And seeing the cliff tops crowded with Britons in their blue woad paint, all jumping up and down doing the walla 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 bit, you might expect there was a hesitation to actually start the ball rolling. Now, Napoleon said, in war, it is not men that matter, it is the man. It was not the Roman army that crossed the Rubicon, it was Caesar. In war, the individual example is what really matters. And in this case, it was not, in fact, Julius Caesar who took the initiative in person. It was this famous Aquilifer, or standard bearer of the 10th Legion, who, after, we've heard, making a fair speech to his colleagues, jumped off the prow of his landing ship and probably disappeared into 10 feet of water. But he'd broken the spell, and the troops were soon jumping in and wading ashore, and the action was on.
The army which Claudius had at his disposal in 43 AD was the most efficient and professional fighting machine the world had ever seen. The backbone of the army were the legions made up of Roman citizens. They were regular soldiers who had signed on for a term of 25 years. Recruits were drilled rigorously in both weapons use and various tactical formations, and regular training kept these units in a state of constant readiness. By AD 43, Roman legionaries were invariably armoured, having a helmet and a set of body armour known as a lorica. The early lorica was made of chainmail and known as lorica hamata. In the 1st century AD, this began to be replaced by the lorica segmentata, a corselet made up of metal plates. A large shield or scutum was also carried. The main weapons of the legionaries consisted of 2 pila or heavy javelins and a short stabbing sword called a gladius. In battle, the pila was first thrown at point-blank range, at which juncture the gladius would be drawn, and the legionaries would jog to engage the shaken enemy. This method of fighting had originally been developed to break up and destroy blocks of opposing spearmen or pikemen, but it was to prove equally effective against the chariots, cavalry, and javelin men of the Britons. In addition to fighting in lines, the Romans used other battle formations totally alien to their barbarian opponents. One of these was the wedge, which was designed to pierce the opposing line so that the Romans could then attack their enemies from the sides and the rear. Another was the testudo, or tortoise formation, used to protect the unit from missile fire when advancing. The smallest unit in the legion was a contubernium, or tent party of 8 men. In barracks, these men would share 2 rooms. On the march, they would share a leather tent and a mule to carry it. The legionaries themselves would carry their own equipment and cooking gear. A century was made up of 10 contubernia and commanded by a centurion aided by an optio. Each century had its own signifier or standard bearer. The smallest tactical unit was the cohort, made up of 6 centuries and numbering 480 men. The cohort was commanded by the senior centurion, who generally left the actual command of his century to his optio. Each cohort had a signum as a standard. Until the middle of the 1st century AD, 10 of these cohorts made up the legion. This was later changed to 9 cohorts of standard size and 1 of double strength. Each legion was commanded by a legate, who had an eagle as its standard. The eagle was the most sacred symbol of the legion, and usually in the care of the most senior cohort. It was carried by the Aquilifer, who was just 1 step down from a centurion. At around this time, the legions also acquired 120 cavalrymen each, organized into 4 turmae of 30 men. In the main, they functioned as messengers and escorts. Each legion also had its own artillery, which consisted of 60 bolt throwers called carabalistae. and 10 large stone throwers called onagri. The technology required to construct these was way beyond barbarian peoples, as the Romans would call them, and they outranged bows, slings, and javelins considerably. The terror which these unreachable weapons must have inspired, especially when shooting flaming missiles at thatched wooden buildings, can well be imagined. Supporting the legions were cohorts of auxiliary infantry and auxiliary cavalry. The auxiliaries were recruited from the provinces of the Roman Empire and served for 25 years, gaining Roman citizenship on their discharge. Their function was to act as light troops and screen the legionaries from ambush or surprise attack. The auxiliaries were often raised from among the very people they were fighting. Their dress and standards of equipment were far lower than the much vaunted legionaries. Auxiliaries were often equipped with cast-off legionary armour and weapons. Adaptations and alterations were also made to uniforms of both legionaries and auxiliaries to suit local conditions, particularly the cold climate of Britain.
The Roman army, as we've already mentioned, was a highly disciplined force, a real killer war machine. And that same efficiency which it represented could be a word for the whole of the Roman state and of Roman civilization which came behind the legions. But it was all based upon the power of the sword in the last analysis. Here we have an example of a Roman gladius reproduction sword, 2-foot long blade, very much a stabbing weapon rather than a hacking weapon, but good and sturdy, so the troops could use it for cutting firewood or cutting palisades, material from the trees, and so forth. The secondary weapon of every Roman soldier, whatever, of the infantry anyhow. Now behind the armies, fighting against the Scots or the Welsh or the other northern tribes of Britannia, as England and Scotland was called at this period, of course, the Romans had to have lines of communication for reinforcements, for transfers of troops from one sector to another, so they built roads behind them. And one of the lasting signs of Roman civilization in Great Britain are the famous straight Roman roads, built very scientifically, and indeed in some parts of the world still exist to this day, because the Romans always built to last, and that's a factor in them. Now, being a highly disciplined people, they also brought schemes of law, systems of law behind them too, because you want a disciplined population supporting the troops or holding the frontiers and paying tribute to Rome and so forth. So Roman law, which still is a very important factor in our modern affairs, was brought to bear. And it is a very large part of modern European community law is in fact still based on Roman law.
The equipment and fighting methods of the Romans' British opponents were very different. The majority of the British warriors were primarily farmers, rather than the professional soldiers which Rome fielded. Most would fight on foot in their family clan or tribal groups, using a spear, javelin, and a long, heavy slashing sword, if they had one. Slings also saw considerable use, especially amongst the tribes of the south and southwest. The missiles used by British slingers would usually be round pebbles. Roman surgeons had a special instrument for removing slingshot from the bodies of their soldiers. Although the range of a sling was inferior to that of a bow, slingshot often did more damage than the arrows of the time. It is thought that the series of ditches and ramparts found at the enormous hill forts which the Britons constructed, such as Maiden Castle in Dorset, were laid out with sling rangers in mind. Armour of any kind was very rare, most Britons having to make do with an oval or round shield, and the magical protection bestowed by the blue patterns painted upon their bodies with woad. The nearest thing which the Britons had to professional soldiers were the aristocratic chariot warriors. The two-horsed British war chariot was built for speed. Each British chariot had a crew of two, the warrior and his driver. The chariot warriors were the best equipped of all the Britons, but even they could rarely boast more than a helmet and shield for protection. Chainmail armour was expensive and very rare indeed. The armies of the Britons could field considerable numbers of chariots. During Caesar's second expedition to Britain, his opponent, Cassivellaunus, used a force of 4,000 charioteers to harry the Roman advance. A step down from the chariot warriors were cavalry, armed similarly to the foot warriors, but having the extra mobility provided by the horse. They worked best in conjunction with the chariots. Nearly 90 years before the time of Claudius, Caesar had observed the British chariots at war.
Genus hoc est ex essedis pugnae. Primo, per omnes partes per requitant et tela coniciunt. Atque ipso terrore equitum strepit tu rotorum omdines plurumque perturbant. Et cum se inter equitum turmas insinua verunt, ex essedis disiliunt et pedibus proliantur. Aurigae interim, Paulatim ex prolio excedunt, atque ita curus collocant, ut si illi a multitudine hostium premantur, expeditum ad suos receptum habeant. Ita mobilitatem equitum, stabilitatem peditum in proliis praestant. Ac tantum iusu quotidiano et exercitatione efficiunt, ut in declivi et praecipiti loco incitatu locos sustinere, et brevi moderari ac flectere, et per timonem procurere, et in iugo insistere, et se inde in currus citissimi recipere consuerint.
At the time of the Roman invasion, politics in Britain were in a state of flux. Cunobellinus of the Cativaloni, ruler of a powerful Belgic hegemony in southeast Britain, had just died. His old age had seen a degree of squabbling amongst his sons, one of whom, Adminius, was expelled and fled to the Roman Empire. Adminius persuaded the emperor, Gaius Caligula, to support him, and in 40 AD Caligula launched an invasion of Britain. The expedition failed to venture further than the coast of Gaul, however. 6 months later, the unfortunate Caligula was murdered, and his uncle Claudius succeeded him as emperor. In Britain, too, there had been a death in the nobility. When Cunobellinus died, his kingdom was divided between two of his other sons, Togodummus, who is thought to have ruled an eastern kingdom from Colchester, or Camalodunum, as it was named by the Celts, and Caradoc, whose realm was centred at Caliver, the old capital of the recently absorbed Atrebates. Caradoc was to prove an implacable foe of Rome, and figures largely in the Roman histories of the time. They call him by a name which is much more familiar to us: Caratacus. Caratacus is described by Tacitus, a later Roman historian whose works have survived the intervening centuries, as ruling many peoples. Caratacus and his warriors quickly set about enlarging his realm at the expense of his neighbours. Among them was a certain Verica, whose kingdom centred upon Celcibil. When Caratacus overthrew him, he followed Adminius to take refuge with Rome. The flight of Adminius and Verica gave the Romans two useful pawns, should intervention in Britain be considered. In addition, other British rulers were promised that they could remain in power in return for their cooperation, or at least neutrality, should Rome invade. This certainly applied to the Iceni of Norfolk and to Cogidumus. It seems likely that Caratacus himself was also offered the status of a client king, an offer he refused. The only continuous account of the Claudian invasion to survive the intervening years was written in Greek by Dio Cassius, nearly 200 years after the events he describes.
At about this time, Aulus Plautius, a distinguished senator, commanded an expedition to Britain. For a certain Bericus, expelled from the island by internal strife, had persuaded Claudius to dispatch a force there.
Whether or not Claudius launched the invasion purely to aid Verica is not known, but from subsequent events this seems unlikely. Britain had provided a safe refuge for enemies of Rome since Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul. And perhaps it was felt to be potentially dangerous to allow such a focus of anti-Roman feeling to flourish unchecked. Or perhaps it was deemed necessary to regain the prestige lost in the wake of Caligula's farcical invasion attempt of a few years earlier. Another factor could well have been Claudius's wish to emulate, and better, Julius Caesar's wondrous expedition to the ends of the earth in 55 BC, or the emperor's desire to celebrate a triumph in Rome and thus add further luster to his house. The material benefits of a new grain, cattle, gold, silver and iron-rich province was also doubtless considered. Whatever the real reasons, in the spring of 43 AD, 4 legions were gathered to form an invasion force. The 2nd Legion, the Augusta, the 9th Legion, the Hispania, the 14th Legion, the Jemima, and the 20th Legion, known as Valeria Victrix, were summoned and mustered at the northern coast of Gaul. In addition to the legions, 20,000 auxiliaries were also summoned. These have been estimated at around 13,000 men of the auxiliary cohorts and 7,000 cavalry, making the total invasion force around 40,000 strong. The commander appointed to lead the expedition was Aulus Plautius. Plautius met a major hurdle right at the start, as his men mutinied and refused to embark. Dio recalled the events in his history.
The soldiers grumbled at having to campaign outside the inhabited world, as they put it, and they refused to listen to him, until the freedman Narcissus, who had been sent by Claudius, mounted the commander's platform and began to address them. At this point, they were still more annoyed at Aulus Plautius, and disinclined to let Narcissus utter a word. But all of a sudden, they shouted out aloud the well-known cry, "Lo, Saturnalia!" This because, at the festival of Saturn, the slaves dress up in their master's clothes to keep holiday. After this, they readily obeyed Plautius's orders.
To guard against the possibility of a contested landing, the Roman invasion force had sailed in 3 separate divisions. It is thought that the major force made for Richborough, whilst the diversionary force landed at Dover and marched westwards to draw off any forces which may have gathered to oppose the landings. But what of the 3rd force? Later, forts were built at both Richborough and Dover to hamper attacks against Roman Britain, and another fort was built at nearby Lympne for the same purpose. And perhaps Lympne was the site chosen for the 3rd landing. Alternatively, perhaps the 3rd force was intended to link up with British allies, in which case Cogidumus's later power base around Chichester could have been chosen. Archaeological remains of legionary equipment from this period have indeed been found here. Having heard of the mutiny, and remembering Caligula's abortive invasion of a few years before, Caratacus had not thought it necessary to muster his warriors. This gave Plautius time to secure his main base at Richborough. It seems likely that the British tribes of eastern Kent, seeing the strength of the Roman forces, rapidly came to terms with him. The news that the Romans had actually invaded after all must have come as a rather nasty surprise, but the 2 Belgic leaders, Caratacus and Togodumus, nonetheless gathered their warriors to oppose the Romans. Caratacus and Togodumus joined forces and, boosted by further reinforcements, decided to make a stand at the river Medway near to where Rochester now stands. At this point, the river was tidal, and the Britons thought that the Romans would be unable to cross without a bridge. Plautius was, however, well prepared for this eventuality. A number of Batavian and Frisian auxiliary units were specially trained to cross rivers in full armour. These were ordered across the river, and their unexpected attack, coupled with the confusion they caused by killing numerous chariot horses, allowed Vespasian, in command of the 2nd Augusta Legion, to make a further crossing at a different point upstream. Vespasian's crossing also took the Britons unawares and was able to inflict considerable casualties. Vespasian was destined later to become a future Roman emperor. There was much fierce fighting as the Romans brought more and more men across the river, whilst the Britons attempted to snuff out the original bridgehead. Finally, after almost being captured at one point, Gnaeus Osidius Geta, who was now in command of the bridgehead, was victorious, and the surviving Britons retreated to the next defensible river line, the Thames. Although it was not immediately clear at the time, the fate of free Celtic Britain had been sealed. The Britons were able to reach the north bank of the Thames without too much difficulty and took up positions there. But the Batavians again managed to swim over, and another force managed to secure a bridge a little further upriver. Many Britons were cut off between these Roman pincers and cut down. But an incautious pursuit of others resulted in some losses to the Roman auxiliaries when they became trapped in impassable marshes. Autogodumus was killed soon after the Medway crossing, either through treachery or in one of the skirmishes which followed the battle. This left Caratacus as sole commander of the Belgae. Realizing that it would be impossible to prevent the Romans from reaching Camalodunum, he retreated westwards towards the land of the Silures. From his western base, Caratacus was to remain a thorn in the side of the Roman invaders for a further 9 long years. The Romans did not advance to take Cunobellinus, capital at Colchester, immediately, however. Plautius now sent word to the Emperor Claudius, so that he could come to Britain and secure the final defeat of the Cativaloni personally. Claudius sailed from Italy to Marseille and then proceeded by road and river to Boulogne on the north coast of Gaul. He brought with him some reinforcements which had been gathered earlier, including a detachment of the Emperor's personal Praetorian Guard and a number of elephants, the first which had ever been seen in Britain.
Crossing the Channel, Claudius joined the troops who had been awaiting him on the Thames. Taking them with him, he crossed the river, engaged the barbarians who had gathered to dispute his advance, gained the victory, and captured Camalodunum, the royal seat of Cunobellinus. Later, he won over numerous tribes, some by battle, some by negotiation, and was hailed imperator several times, contrary to custom, for the rule was that none should be allowed to receive this accomplishment more than once in any campaign. Disarming these tribes, he handed them over to Aulus Plautius, who received instructions to subdue the remainder of the country.
According to inscriptions on triumphal arches at Rome, 11 British kings submitted to Claudius during his 16-day visit. Their cooperation was vital for the next stage of the conquest. The 2 most dangerous tribes still in arms against Rome were the Durotriges of Dorset and Somerset and the Belgae of Dorset and Wiltshire. The task of subduing them was given to Vespasian and his legion, the Second Augusta, and it is possible that they were dispatched before the arrival of Claudius. A biography of Vespasian by Suetonius Tranquillus tells us that whilst in Britain, Vespasian fought 30 battles, subjugated 2 tribes, and captured 30 oppida, or native fortresses, as well as the whole of the Isle of Wight. Vespasian's campaign in the south and west, launched from Chichester, must have been a fairly swift affair, as excavations of some hill forts in this area suggest that improvements to their fortifications were suddenly halted in this period. The excavations also show the effectiveness of the Roman weaponry, with skeletons showing evidence of skulls punctured by Pila. In addition, the skeleton showed evidence of sword slashes and thrusts from the long spatha of the auxiliaries and the shorter gladius of the legionaries. One skeleton was found to have a bolt from a Roman catapult still embedded in its spine. The remains of the hill fortresses in this area, such as Maiden Castle in Dorset, are still very impressive by any standards. How much more formidable must they have seemed with their stone and wooden ramparts still intact, as Vespasian's legionaries must have seen them. Thanks to their superior weaponry and training, however, the Celtic fortresses do not seem to have posed too serious an obstacle for the Romans. Following an artillery barrage of flaming missiles to set fire to the buildings and cause confusion within, the hail of missiles would then be concentrated at certain designated points, so as to allow the legionaries, probably in testudo formations, to fight their way in. Once inside, the individual valour of the British warriors would prove no match for the disciplined charge of the Roman troops. In this kind of operation, it was often the auxiliary troops who would be used for the initial assault, rather than the precious legions, who would be deployed only when strictly necessary. As the Augusta legion subdued the southwest, the 20th Legion built a legionary fortress at Camalodunum so as to establish a strong base to the rear of the advancing legions. The activities of the 9th and 14th Legions following Claudius's departure are less clear. It seems likely that the 9th advanced north through the territory of the Caratani and established a base at Lindum or modern Lincoln. Similarly, it is probable that the 14th advanced through the Midlands and established themselves in the lands of the Dobonai. When Aulus Plautius returned to Rome in 47 AD, the frontier zone of the Roman province of Britannia had been established. A band running from the River Humber through Lincoln, Leicester and Cirencester to Exeter on the south coast. Plautius' successor as governor of Britain was Ostorius Scapula. But before he arrived to take over the reins, the situation in Britain deteriorated dramatically. Taking advantage of the change of governors, Caratacus launched a concerted attack on the tribes friendly to Rome. No accounts of Caratacus's movements survive for the years between the Medway battle of 43 AD and his sudden reappearance in 47 AD. But we can safely assume that this implacable enemy of Rome had not been inactive.
We are quite right to be very admiring of the Roman military machine, but I mustn't give you the impression that everything went smoothly, even in the conquest of a hairy little offshore island called Britannia. By 47 AD, we find the major conquests getting underway. But as late as 60 AD, we are still fighting, the Romans are still fighting against the Welsh, for example, and they never tamed the Picts and the Scots, because after all, they built the famous walls in the north of the country to seal off the Roman Empire and a line between Carlisle and Newcastle upon Tyne. There were times when the Roman army, in fact, had a full-scale disaster on its hands, when, in spite of their vaunted training, their discipline, and the rest of it, they had a disaster when everything broke down. There was a whole legion lost in Scotland, for example. We've never known where, but it disappeared from the Roman army lists and was never recreated. We don't know what happened to it, but we do know what happened in Germany to 4 legions under the consul Varro, which in the Teutoburgerwald, about the same sort of period, the complete army disappeared without trace. So things could go wrong for the Romans, and indeed, during the Iceni revolt of Boudica and her tribes, again, a whole Roman legion is supposed to have been butchered in the early stages of that operation. But like all armies, the Romans don't make a great deal of noise about their defeats. The victories, yes, they have every detail of those, but their disasters, they prefer to draw a veil across.
Despite the occasional setbacks, the lion's share of the victorious war during this period fell to the Romans. Following 2 major defeats at river crossings and the fall of the Cativalorni kingdom, it was by now obvious to Caratacus that Rome could not be defeated in set-piece battles on open ground, no matter how bravely the Celts might fight. The power of the legions was just too great. The answer to his dilemma was to fight the Romans only in difficult hilly or wooded terrain, and to conduct a hit-and-run guerrilla campaign rather than face them in open battle. By 47 AD, Caratacus seems to have been chosen as war leader by many of the yet unconquered tribes. It would have been impossible for him to have achieved this position without the active support of the Druids. Roman historians imply that the main reason for the Roman antipathy towards the Druids was their practice of human sacrifice and divination from the entrails of their human victims. In addition to their role as nature priests, however, the Druids served as the teachers and advisors of the Celtic nobility. Indeed, this is the stratum of Celtic society from which the Druids themselves were drawn. Consequently, they wielded considerable influence over Celtic society as a whole, not just a single clan or tribe. They were steadfast in their opposition to Roman rule, which is why the Romans wished to destroy them. Obviously, at this time, the Druids saw Caratacus as their best chance of survival.
Well, Of course, there were some temples in ancient Britain. There's Stonehenge, for example, and Woodhenge at Avebury was almost certainly, although it is still argued about, religious centres of one sort or another. But with the Romans, they bring in a great many different gods, of course, of which, from the army's point of view, the cult of Mithras was the most important, the slaying of the great bull. But we must never forget, it was also the Romans in the time of Constantine that brought Christianity to Great Britain for the first time. It wouldn't last, it would have to start again after the Dark Ages, but it was the Romans who brought in Christianity, and there are several ruins of Christian churches built by the Romans still to be found in London, York, and others of the great cities.
At first, Caratacus' attacking strategy of leaving the Roman forts alone and harrying the pro-Roman settlements behind them met with success, but he underestimated the speed of Ostorius' reaction. Assembling a force of auxiliaries, Ostorius launched a counter-offensive which soon drove the invaders out of the Roman province. By this stage of the campaign, many of the auxiliaries would actually be raised from among the defeated British tribes, and increasingly they took on the habits and dress styles of the Britons. By the end of the year 47 AD, the immediate threat to Roman Britain had been dispelled. To make his position more secure, Ostorius now disarmed all those tribes within the province, so as to prevent sympathizers of Caratacus in Roman territory from giving him armed help in the future. This edict was also applied to the client kingdom of the Iceni, some of whom refused to give up their weapons and promptly revolted. The rebels gathered behind a hastily fortified earthwork, which was unapproachable by cavalry. Ostorius first surrounded this, then stormed it with auxiliary infantry and dismounted cavalry. The following year, Ostorius mounted a punitive expedition against the tribes of modern Flintshire. The Welsh tribes attempted to ambush the Roman force, but this went badly wrong. Thereafter, the Romans ravaged their territory far and wide, taking considerable booty. They had almost reached the Irish Sea when news of a conflict amongst the Brigantes reached them. The Brigantes were the largest confederation of tribes in the British Isles, controlling most of what is now northern England. There were two main factions within the Brigantes. The Queen, Cartamandua, was formally recognized as a client of the Roman Empire and led the pro-Roman faction. She had her power base in the southern region of the Brigante territories. Her husband, Venutius, in the north, however, was sympathetic to the aims of Caratacus, as were his followers. Being hard-pressed in Wales, Caratacus seems to have instigated a Brigantian revolt in the north with a view to shifting Cartamandua from power. This was a situation which Ostorius could not tolerate, and he marched into Brigantian territory with a mixed force of legionaries and auxiliaries to put down the revolt. Those who had taken up arms against the Queen were executed, and the rest pardoned. In 50 AD, Ostorius decided that some major changes had to be made to the arrangements of his predecessor. The border established by Plautius just wasn't practical, so Ostorius decided to push it further towards Wales. To do this, Ostorius established a colonia, a town founded to house retired legionaries at Colchester, with 2,000 to 3,000 retired veterans based there. Ostorius was now able to move the 20th Legion to a new base at Gloucester. During the summer, the 20th Legion left its new base to march into South Wales, and the 14th made a similar probe further north. The year's campaign was inconclusive. Caratacus did not oblige Ostorius by meeting the Romans in battle, being content to play cat and mouse while harrying their communications. The following year, however, he would not even have this option. The deliberate burning and looting which the Roman forces had carried out led to much grumbling against Caratacus as a leader. He now needed to inflict a telling defeat on the Romans if he was to maintain his position as Celtic war leader. Consequently, in AD 51, he changed his strategy and moved the theatre of war to the lands of the Ordovices in mid-Wales. Caratacus decided to risk a battle. A Roman historian named Tacitus, who wrote around 90 AD, within living memory of these events, described Caratacus' position as follows. He selected a site where numerous factors, notably approaches and escape routes, helped him and impeded us. On one side, there were steep hills. Wherever the gradient was gentler, stones were piled into a kind of rampart. And at his front, there was a river without easy crossings. The defences were strongly manned. Despite the apparent strength of Caratacus's chosen position, the Roman soldiers shouted eagerly for battle. They must have been heartily sick of tramping through Welsh rain on the lookout for an unseen enemy, and wished to put an end to the trouble and discomfort this Caratacus was causing them. Having surveyed the ground, Astorius ordered the attack. The Romans crossed the river without difficulty and climbed up to the stone rampart. Here, they were at the mercy of the British slingers until they adopted a testudo formation and pulled down the rough stonework. Once through this barrier, the Romans' superior equipment and training enabled them to make short work of the defenders. Amongst those taken prisoner were Caratacus's wife, daughter, and brother. Caratacus himself managed to escape and sought refuge with the Brigantes, and no doubt he hoped to enlist their support to continue his campaign against the Romans. But this was not to be. Queen Catamandua betrayed the noble warrior and arrested Caratacus on his arrival. He was then handed over to the Romans. Tacitus tells us that Caratacus's followers, brothers, wife and daughter were brought before the emperor in turn. Caratacus won the admiration of Rome by his noble bearing and his courageous appearance. But there also appears to have been an element of logic in Caratacus's character. According to Tacitus, he was much taken with the splendors of Rome and asked, "When you have all this, why do you envy us our poor hovels?" The others, frightened, degraded themselves by entreaties, but there were no downcast looks or appeals for mercy from Caratacus. On reaching the dais, he spoke in these terms: "Had my lineage and rank been accompanied by only moderate success, I should have come to this city as a friend rather than prisoner, and you would not have disdained to ally yourself with one so nobly born, the ruler of so many nations. As it is, humiliation is my lot, glory yours. I had horses, men, arms, wealth. Are you surprised? I am sorry to lose them. If you want to rule the world, does it follow that everyone else welcomes enslavement? If I had surrendered without a blow before being brought before you, neither my downfall nor your triumph would have become famous. If you execute me, they will be forgotten. Spare me, and I shall be an everlasting token of your mercy." Moved by the proud eloquence and upright being of his vanquished foe, Claudius did indeed show mercy, and Caratacus stepped off the stage of recorded history as a free man. In Britain, however, there was still considerable resistance to the invasion, particularly from the Silures, who defeated a complete Roman legion. But with the departure of Caratacus, the focus of Britain's resistance had gone. Other than in isolated revolts and uprisings, the grip of Rome slowly tightened on Britain. That grip would, however, be challenged spectacularly by a great warrior queen and her followers. That is another story. Perdica, 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 perdica.